Welcome back, everybody. Thanks for tuning in today. Down here in the reloading room, and I'm going to talk about reloading for precision rifles. In particular, my process for reloading and how I end up achieving half MOA or better on all of my precision rifles. First off, I should probably give you a little bit of background on what type of shooting I do. I don't do any type of F-class or bench rest style stuff. Most of the things I do are long range, just shooting steel. I shoot an occasional PRS match here and there, and for the most part, I do shoot quite a bit of paper here at home, see what type of groups I can get out of my guns. Like I said, for the most part, I try to get at least below half MOA. That way, when I am shooting groups or shooting positional stuff, I know that it wasn't the gun, and if things are messed up, then it is me. I've been shooting precision rifles for a little over 20 years now, and reloading somewhere in the mark of 16, 17 years. I don't quite remember exactly when we started reloading. It wasn't right away when we got into rifles, namely because me and my buddy, we didn't know if we could actually beat what type of accuracy we were getting out of our guns using federal gold medal match, and back then you could still get Black Hills ammo pretty readily, and we were doing pretty good with it. We thought that maybe you'd have to go to some type of wild extremes and super high precision to be able to beat that stuff, but as it turns out, it's not really that hard to get under half MOA out of a reload with some basic reloading equipment. I am going to say that these are my opinions about reloading. This is just the accumulation of my experiences from working on my rifles and some other people's rifles, working on them, and just my experiences and my opinions on these things. Your opinions may differ. Neither one of them is going to be right, wrong, or otherwise. But the first thing I am going to say is that cases being consistent are probably one of the top things that we have to look for. But, and here's the big one, there is no such thing as a perfect case. Perfect does not exist. We can get really, really close, but there is no such thing as perfect. It doesn't matter what brand you use, high end, low end, whatever. There's no such thing as perfect. So if I'm starting out with a batch of fired cases, the first thing I'm going to want to do with them is knock out all the primers. If we knock out the primers with a decapping pin, that's going to end up saving the life of our tumbler media, and especially if you're using a sonic cleaner, it's going to make that fluid last a whole lot longer. If they're fairly clean burning cases and everything, then I'll just throw them in the tumbler for a little while, knock all the carbon off of them, call it good. But if I'm shooting suppressed, or I've shot them probably 3 times, 4 times, then I like to use the sonic cleaner, because that'll help get a lot of that carbon buildup off there. Especially shooting suppressed, the outside of the case is just covered in it, let alone the inside. The next step is annealing. I used to just take a drill, drop my cases in there, put a little bit of Templax on the neck, and then hold them in front of the torch. Eventually, after doing it a few thousand times, you kind of get an eye for when you've heated that neck area just enough. You see a little bit of color flash down onto the shoulder, and you don't really need to use the Templax anymore. Now, I use this anneal ease machine. It's a whole lot simpler. Take your cases, stack them up, and they're just going to automatically run through there for you. Whole lot quicker, whole lot simpler. I can be doing something else while this thing's running. The next step you need to do is lube up your cases. Got to have something to run these things through the sizing die. I'm all out of Imperial sizing wax. I do really like that stuff. I've got this stuff here. A little bit of this goes a long ways. It's also the only stuff that I've ever dented any shoulders. If you get a little too much of that lube right in here, it'll hydraulic that in and dent them up. The pad also tends to collect dirt and carbon, hair, all that. Not real fond of using that stuff. The other one that I use a lot of is just Hornady One Shot. I don't recommend using this stuff inside. I try to take the cases outside and spray them because, as it says right on there, vapor is harmful. So, moving on to the press. This one right here is an RCBS Rock Chucker. That's probably my number one press that I use for everything that I do for precision rifle stuff. I do have a single stage Hornady. I've got certain calibers set up just for that one. Since it's got the bushings in there, I do use that a little bit for precision rifle. I do not use my progressive press for much of anything on precision rifle. I only make just some blasting ammo off of this thing, just for the ARs and maybe the 9mm and the 40s and 45s and stuff. But this is what I use 90% of the time for all my precision rifle stuff. It's run good and true. Now it's time to size them all. When it comes to sizing dies, I don't have a favorite brand. I tend to use quite a few different ones, just depending on what's going to work for the situation, which brass I'm using, thickness of it, all that. Got a handful of neck bushing, shoulder bump styles, full length and X dies, bushing full length, stuff like that. In general, I just end up using a full length sizer most of the time. Some of them I go ahead, rip out the expander ball on there, and I just end up using expander mandrels instead. I've also kind of gotten away from using a lot of those neck bushing ones like those. In the end, they will start making a donut, if that'll look right down in the bottom of there, because that can't size all the way down the neck. So then you got to cut them and under relief them right there. I don't like having to mess with all that. So I just use a regular full-length sizer, mandrels if I can. The other thing that I like to do is, especially on these RCBS ones, like this is just a decapper die, so I left it on here. That little brass nut. I've broke quite a few of those. Not just stripped them out, they've actually like cracked in half for some reason on me. So I replace almost all of those with the Hornady ones that clamp from the side. They've got the flats for a wrench on them, so you can kind of snug them down, or if you have to, unsnug them, break them loose. Or I'll use the Forester one that also basically clamps sideways, versus on here, when you screw that into those threads, it'll tend to give it just a little bit of a pivot in there, and I don't like that idea with my sizing dies. Since we're at sizing, this is about where I figured we ought to talk about new brass. So depending on what I'm using, if it's something like Peterson or these Lapua cases, I don't do anything to them. I might just chamfer the inside of the case mouth and fill them up. The Starline stuff that I've used has actually been pretty good. I haven't had too many bad cases, and they seem super consistent for thickness in them. But then I grabbed this bag of 45 Colt here, just so I can show you some examples of these, because I found that sometimes, I mean, it's not bad brass, but somewhere between 2 and 5 of them out of every 100, I just end up straight throwing away. Examples like these here, sometimes they just basically punch that flash hole in there, and sometimes they're not exactly round. And then if we can get this to focus down in there, like in the top of that one, there's a great big burr down in the bottom of there that you got to cut out. Some of them, on the case mouths of them, one of these was pretty rough. They got some nicks and dings, stuff in it. And sometimes they're bad enough that you can't cut them down far enough, or you can't round them back out by putting them in a cedar die, or excuse me, a sizer die, and get them fixed. So I just end up pitching some of them. But for as cheap as they are, I guess it doesn't really matter, because you only paid, a third of the price of the good brass with them. So speaking about cutting them, let's get on to that. Cutting cases to length. I use this Forster original case trimmer. I do have the drill adapter to take the handle off and run a drill on the back end of it, but with the weight of the drill, I'd noticed that it was getting a little bit of M play, because this piece is just aluminum on here. So I was getting a little bit of flex. I didn't like that idea, so I put the hand crank back on. This is one of those things I've been meaning to upgrade for a while now and just have not done it. On the other side of cutting and trimming, you've got neck turning and having to cut down case necks and thin them down. This is something that I don't like doing. I try to avoid it at all costs. If I've got a whole batch of cases and 3 of them have thin spots in the necks, I don't turn down the 100 cases to match the 3 thin ones. I go ahead and take the 3 thin ones, use them like what I did here, and just use them so that I can adjust the seating depth on my dies and stuff like that. So they're not quite wasted. They got put to use at least once. But that also gets into measuring your stuff. Do yourself a favor. Buy yourself a good dial caliper, good micrometer right off the bat. It's going to help you, especially when having to do stuff like turning your necks. I've got one gun that I need to turn necks for when I use Peterson brass. The Peterson brass is just too thick to fit in my chamber and leave enough room for expansion on there, so I've got to turn those necks down. For the most part, I just end up using Hornady instead. But if we don't have a good dial caliper, we don't have a good micrometer, we can't measure evenly what that neck thickness even is. So if we're taking off what we think is 1/1000th and it's actually 1/1000th and a half, 2/1000ths, well, then we're going to screw a whole bunch of stuff up. Or even when it comes to using neck bushings, then we might order the wrong size neck bushing, and then we won't have as much tension on them as what we need to do. So by all means, buy a good brand of dial caliper. Now that the cases are all sized up, trimmed up, if they're the cheaper ones, then I go ahead and use that flash holdy burr, get that burr out of there. That way it doesn't go sending down the barrel eventually. Then over to the case prep center, inside, outside chamfering, primer pocket brush. Right now I do have a military crimp remover in there. I do also have a primer pocket uniformer, which I don't really use. In my testing, I can't say that I've noticed any difference in velocities or consistencies by uniforming the primer pocket at all, so I just don't do that. Then run the case mouth across that brush, make sure you don't have any burrs again, send down the barrel. That's off to priming. I prefer to use a hand primer just due to the sheer fact that you get a little bit more feel for how those primer pockets are doing. And then specifically, once they do start to wear out, or on a couple of my guns, I mean, they are running a little on the higher pressure side so that you know when to quit, so you're not running that case out a little too far and end up blowing primers out, scorching bolt faces, you know, wrecking guns and stuff. So I do prefer to do it by hand still. For charging my cases, I use this old RCBS Charge Master that I've had for over a decade. Knock on wood there that it keeps running that way and I didn't just jinx myself and tomorrow this thing dies on me. I do check it against an RCBS 1010 balance beam scale. Gravity doesn't lie and it's always consistent, so I've got that thing to just make sure that I keep this in line. It really has never been off unless I've done something wrong when I calibrate it, you know, messed it up somehow there. I do always keep a little flashlight, this little safari land around, that way I can look inside my cases, make sure nothing looks outside the ordinary on the height of the powder inside the case compared to all the rest of them, or make sure that I didn't miss one. The next thing to do would be seat some projectiles. I use the Hornady overall length gauge to find where the lands are at. Got my 6 ARC case on there right now because that's what I'm working on. Also use their comparator gauge with their different bushings to measure those things out. As I showed before, I use different brands of dies. And for the most part, I've found that all 3 of these dies are going to seat projectiles just as straight as the next one. What I do like, or I prefer, are ones with the micrometer on there because it's just easier when going back and forth from like these ones that I'm testing here first are 75 grainers. When I move to the 108, it's just easier to be able to record that number down and go back and forth. Or when you're doing a seating depth test, it's also a whole lot easier to pick those, you know, whether you're doing 3,000ths jump or 5,000ths jump, whatever you prefer. It's just way easier to do on either one of these than guessing that 1/8 of a turn that's about 5,000ths on that style of seater. All 3 of these have the capability to, let me give this a spin here on this run out gauge, a little less, almost 2,000ths of an inch. All of them are going to be able to do that same spec if we're using good brass. That is where that neck thickness comes in. If we've got a thin spot in there, you can bet that amount that we're off on there is probably because of the thin spot that's in that neck. When you seat a bullet, regardless of what brand of die you're using, the case in the neck is going to expand more in the weaker spot and it's going to offset that bullet. That 2,000ths that one's off really isn't going to matter much, especially since almost all my guns are magazine fed guns, especially like this 6 Creedmoor right here. This is for my PRS gun. Running this big long bullet up that feed ramp throws that off more than 2,000ths than what that is there. When it goes into the chamber, it will kind of self-correct itself a little bit because the section between about right there and right there is the lead in your chamber. There's only a 0.5 in there, so that bullet has to be at least so straight, otherwise it's just not going to enter the actual chamber. So it does self-correct itself a little. But how much damage does the bullet incur when self-correcting itself out? That's your problem. That's also why bench rest guys don't use box magazines, because they don't want to incur that bending of the projectile. For all practical use, just general long range shooting, PRS shooting, that 2,000ths that's off doesn't matter. The reason why I use multiple different cedar dies most of the time actually has to do more with the profile of the bullet. On some of them, the cedar stem that's in here and the profile that's on there, some of them just don't match up with the brands of bullets that you use, whether I'm using VLDs or these ELDMs or Sierra Match King. Some of them just don't match up well and smash the tip, or like on this one, you can see there's just a little bit of a ring around that tip in there. I've always wondered about that on some of them, especially your expanding style bullets like this here. If we've got a ring or a gouge on this bullet, is it going to expand correctly or not? I don't know. That might be another test for another day. But there's my take on reloading. Thanks for watching. Thanks for commenting and sharing. Thanks for subscribing to everybody that has. And in the future, I'll probably be making some more videos, especially about reloading here. Show you my short and long forms of how I do my load development. So we'll catch you on the next one.